It's my special honor to welcome you and to introduce Owen Lewis, who is, I think, a physician by day and a poet by night. He's also been a Chesterwood neighbor for 30 years. He's the author of 3 poetry collections and 2 chapbooks. Honors include International Hippocratic Prize for Poetry and Medicine, the Jean Pendrick Award of the New England Poetry Club, and finalist for the Pablo Neruda Award of the Nimrod International Literary Journal. In his spare time, he maintains a practice of psychiatry and is professor at Columbia University, where he teaches narrative medicine. Most of all, he's a great friend of Chesterwood, and you will hear more, but he lives very close to the Chesterwood campus. In the tradition of our site-specific sculpture shows, which I hope you'll take the opportunity, if not tonight, on another occasion, to walk through our woods, we have a site-specific sculpture by Rick and Laura Brown that we held over for another season, and I think you'll have a surprise walking through the woods and seeing their work, which was carved from fallen trees and distressed trees from the Chesterwood property. So it's of the landscape and by the landscape. So Field Light, Owen Lewis's recent poetry book, is site-specific to Chesterwood and the art and history of Glendale and the Berkshires. As Joan Emery, another neighbor of ours, said in a recent review in The Edge of the book, and I quote, "Feel the history of the road, read Lewis's book, and feel your heart quicken with the pulse of his lively, bold writing. Feel how entwined that which he knows and has lived assimilates his love of nature, his awareness of injustice, his enthrallment with those who once lived in his house, who once walked this same road," unquote. Without further ado, please help me in welcoming Owen Lewis.
A little bit about the book. It's poetry, but it's also some prose, also some dramatic sections written in dramatic form. I'm writing a personal story, but I'm also writing history. Now, that may seem strange to think of poets writing history, but it's not exactly textbook history. A lot of it is imagined history. The book is footnoted to really highlight where known facts blend into imagined facts. It's doubly narrated. There's an I in throughout the book, and then there's also a character referred to as Dr. Lewis, who, like the history, is somewhat me, somewhat not me, some version. The book, at the top of each of the sections, there is an indicator of time and place often, because the book moves across centuries and it changes places. So to keep up with that. And the first entry is 2018 Glendale Crossing. Where's Glendale Crossing? Well, there's no actual Glendale Crossing. You could imagine where the railroad tracks cross Van Duzenville Road, or on Division Street, or right off of 183. Any one of those would do as Glendale Crossing, and the book begins having been stopped for one of those long, endlessly long trains to go through, and it ends similarly stopped and in this way indicating a passage. And we'll see where. Dusk. A freight train crossing the road out of the dusk, back into dust, once out of the east and into the west. A long delay in Worcester, it won't reach Pittsfield until long after dark, and won't take him where he needs to go. A lone driver stopped in his auto, a flickering of metal, and the low sun behind him spotlights the lines car by car. Providence, Worcester, Boston, Albany, New York, Central, Providence. Against the deepening sky, he sees the horizon hauled by the train. Its pulsing click-clack rusty wheels, the strained axles singing of tonnage. The trainmen know this crossing, its lights and switches, the couplings and uncouplings, maze of tracks, maze of mistakes. Stalled, the flashing arm before him, he's held up by the train and held in place, this place, how long, he doesn't know. Before him, it's signaling bells, endless bells, not chimes, not carillons, bells. And still at the crossing, in the bells, a black bell sound, a shovel packing soil, hitting stone and light, falls like gauze once wetting veil. White churches and pointed steeples of thudding bells. The sky drapes too deep its blue, its unexpected cloth striping of flag, and memory of anthem. My darker light drops into the Berkshire air, if painted by whose hand, if sung by what voice sustained. A soft breeze hiding in the air, shadows across my arm, asking what, whispering what. And I think especially my psychiatric colleagues who are here will appreciate this next poem. 1991, State Office of Mental Health downsizes asylums. Inmates wander off. In my New York office, phones constant ringing, my then-wife's panic call. An insane playground stampede, mothers crashing, strollers, stuffed bears, shoes, dollies flying, the sandbox where the kids play. A man shits and grunts, then paws at it like a cat. Who are these people? I confess, I signed the physician's petition, lobbied Albany for a plan to free the state patients with a new Bill of Rights, an Emancipation Proclamation. Old guard docs surrender. I tried to do right, trying to keep everyone happy, keeping instead everyone's unhappiness, making me feel criminal. He rose up right out of the sand, lost a blanket, nearly lost the kids, enough melting pot. We need to get away. Get away. You need to do something. Do something. You've got to do something. Also 1991. In rain, I first saw the house, shingled in dormouse gray, through streaked windows of wavering glass, its fields wild, impenetrable November weather, raising a dog's musty history scent. Others' histories. Not a New York smell inside. Underfoot, a wall-to-wall patchwork of multicolored carpet remnants covering up the old chestnut floors. The toddlers each chose a carpet square as home base. I heard the agent say, "No ghosts," but overhead, quick clicking ceiling feet scamper the attic, red squirrels and gray racing the dark. From the eaves, flying squirrels jumping into the mist. Here, the cover of the book is taken from this photograph. I'll put it back here. And in some ways, the inspiration came, and that, by the way, is the back porch, a photograph taken a century ago, the back porch of the house where I now live, and I began imagining who were these people. They've been introduced earlier. Peggy Cresson, the young woman who is the daughter of Daniel Chester French. Hilda Beecher Stowe, who is the granddaughter-in-law of Harriet Beecher Stowe, her sister Gertrude Robinson Smith, William Penn Cresson, her husband, and taking the photograph is a physician, William Lampert. So imagining sitting somewhat on the porch with them, and in this, many of the porch reflections are in a more prose section. This New York Jew sits just outside their picture. Could a Jew fit in here? Much easier to be a Jew in New York. As the Anglicans sip their iced and minted sweet tea, 1922, already 5 congregations have formed just 10 miles north in Pittsfield. 1861, Anshe Amunim, Men of Faith, on Fenn Street. The first shofar blows over Berkshire County. The war between the states, 6 months into its battles, with its own trumpeting. And in the year of the shared iced tea, Jewish farmers 8 miles south in Great Barrington formed their own congregation, Ahavat Shalom, Lovers of Peace, Great Barrington, where Du Bois was born in 1868, attended the Clinton African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Preachers there often praised the shofar's call of freedom. Mr. and Mrs. Cresson, Mrs. Beecher Stowe, Miss Smith, Dr. Lampert, lovers of peace and all humanity, they believe. Now a Jew sits just outside their midst. Hello, hello. Blast a shofar to get their attention. Tekiah, hello. Dr. Lampert would never have acknowledged him then. A turn of fate, flip of the calendar years. He'd have been barred from colleges of medicine. Yet, if he had applied, even if he had applied as Lewis, anglicized from Lifshitz, the admissions committee would still have known. Resting on his chest, rising and falling, on his naps, inspiration, respiration, passing through, Stanley Kunitz's book. Another Jew passing through beyond eyeshot of the photo, Stanley Kunitz, as if Kunitz this moment sat companionably with him, on break from his work as a Worcester Gazette journalist interviewing the artist protesters at the home of the presiding judge, the U.S. versus Sacco and Vanzetti. As if Kunitz were a grandfather he never knew, born and raised not far away in Worcester, and in the same 1922, he begins his studies at Harvard. Kunitz is later denied pursuit of a Harvard PhD by Professor John Livingston Lowe's English Department Chair, Coleridge scholar, who tells him, "Our Anglo-Saxon students would resent being taught English by a Jew." Here's a poem set again, contemporary. It ends with a rather shocking quotation, so saying in advance. More history dumped right in front of me. Here it's everywhere, can't be avoided. Good to poke around. I slow. W.E.B. Du Bois, Boyhood Home Site. A swerve off Route 23, empty parking lot. Why have I never visited? This site where a family lived just outside of town. How far do town lines reach? Where does outside begin or end? The site itself seems lonely. A loud sign just beyond. Respect your neighbor, don't veer off path. Anger lingers. But through the fragrant pines, the cedar's dusk, a boulder, a bench, a marker, no house or hut at the edge of the cornfield. Quiet, just after the Civil War, a town far north of the line of separation, safely a century into land owning freedom. Black and white children play recess tag together, color line quiet enough. But one child gives slight, just one. The veil appears out of nowhere. It is everywhere, the invisible divider. Cornfields beyond the pines rattle in winter. Town churches sent him to Fisk, to Nashville's first loud lessons of Jim Crow, the house behind the curtain of pines dimming. And finally, quote, at Harvard, not of it, 1895, first doctorate to a person of color, where he's made to repeat his entire course of undergraduate studies. Who would have taught him at Fisk, and where did they study? He returned to Great Barrington to bury a wife, later a son. Where does he belong? Drawn to the house, it's gifted to him. He moves back. A lonely childhood, he dies in Ghana. Next day, King proclaims the dream. It is 1963, at the Lincoln Memorial, the proclamation a century old. In 1922, at the memorial's dedication, Du Bois can't forget colored, seated apart, sees the 19-foot statue looming, sees a temple of compromise honoring the Union, not emancipation. And he can't forget the letter sent him from a Clark history class. What teacher allowed it? Will you please tell us whether or not it is true that Negroes are not able to cry? Is it true? Shocking, the racism. Another current day. Needing company all day. The Rising Dale Cafe. Young and old sit around and story the days of Nam, days of Stan, Iraq. Remembering, hoping, waiting for what? Something to begin. Hey, Doc, our veteran from the streets of New York, arm punch, can't forget how friends are greeted here, forgot I had an arm. Got your own Viet Congo crazies there too. Never been, but wow. God damn that train, can you hear it? I live next door, wakes me up every night. Worcester, Boston, Providence sent them off to Kuwait's oil fields, now unmarried, unemployed, un-everything. Here's to noon's wine, midnight's beer, in noon haze, moon glaze, jukebox plays. You can get anything you want at Alice's restaurant. Walk right in. It's around the back. The obvious, not so obvious in the midst of the day, full of drifting mist, overcast. I'm drawn to the field again, the day before or after, a day times before and after. Deer trail crossing the far end, scatter of wild turkey feathers. Nightly passage, a rushed flight, as if the sudden flapping lingers in the stealth of a coyote ambush, almost extinct. A dozen-fold flock hovers just at the field edge. Has Adam summoned them? At wood edge and old pine, a trunk-long lightning rips still open, still bleeding sap. From a storm a decade ago, I touched the wound, and my storm this decade. On my fingers, the scent, the stickiness carries forward, no seams buzzing about my head, ears, and eyes. What do these little gnats see in my eyes? The limits, the craning stretch of a personal life. See more, look, buzzing, looking, further afield, more light than a pair of human eyes can see. They lend their 1,000 prismatic orbits. And I should have introduced, Adam is a character who is the caretaker of the dormouse, but also in many ways of the main character. And he is part Mohegan in background. He also, in this story, claims descendancy from the President's Adams, and he's also related to Elizabeth Mumbet, who we'll hear about next. 2018 and 1781. I always say, cover the weeping bruise, apply ointment and a bandage. Adam says, show the bruise to air and sun and rain. Air's the best salve. Adam says, show the wound, let it tell. Words in the air bring light, words in the air bring freedom. To bruise and wound, to break and burn, eyes burn red, and breath gasp the mangle of injury if wind can carry word. Which wounds to cover, which expose, the wound becomes the hero. Long ago, his Auntie Mumbet, step-great-great-grandmother of Du Bois, born into slavery, 1744 in Claverack, New York, given at age 7 to Hannah Hogenbohm on her marriage to John Ashley, and was moved to Sheffield, Massachusetts. She married, had a child, little Bet. Her husband did not return from the Revolutionary War. Vile-tempered Mistress Hannah one day aimed to strike little Bet with a hot shovel. Mumbet interposed, took the shovel blow to her arm. All winter the wound festered and oozed, and she refused to cover it up. Asked what had happened, she replied, "Ask Mrs." She heard the newly ratified state constitution read in public in the Sheffield Commons, insisted, "I ain't no dumb critter. Won't the law give me my freedom?" And she found her way to a young lawyer, Theodore Sedgwick, in nearby Stockbridge. With another slave of the Ashleys, Sedgwick argued the case for her freedom, Brom and Bet versus Ashley, heard before the County Court of Common Pleas in Great Barrington in August 1781. The jury ruled in Bet's favor, and after slavery banned in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, her freedom. I find still inspiring that so soon after the American Revolution, such a case could be tried and won right here in Great Barrington. The next poem from French's Summer Studio 2018, 1929. And you can peer in the windows afterwards. I refer both to the Lincoln and to his last statue, Andromeda. And I think you'll be able to catch a glimpse of her from the front door. A view of a field like mine, once crop, now vista, French walked the studio porch. How much of its light could his mind hold? He carried the light of these acres with him, sculpting his Lincoln. Each day he'd wheel the model out the studio side, outside. Even now, he wanted to see his Lincoln outdoors again, couldn't let the statue rest. Shadows worked like another set of hands, changing the face. Who is this Lincoln? The dedication already 7 years old. He remembered sketching, sculpting, resculpting. His hands were thinking. To hammer emancipation into stone, to etch light into the nation's memory and future. Lincoln's right hand is open, the left clenched, a foot ready to stride forward, one hesitant step he will next take. Light from his marble eyes filled the studio. Where would it carry his words and deeds? The sculpture often hovered above itself. He knew the marble's flaws, but the man's. Back in the studio, in the waning light, he regarded another, which would be his last rendering, Andromeda, stone smooth as skin. Was it love chained to a craggy rock? Or the guilty myth of a parent's error bound into his child? He watched Peggy, watching the nation honor him, her sculpting, many successes, but Andromeda's chains were thick and heavy. I imagine his nightmare. A vandal chisels through the chains that hold her. She disappears into the sky of many stars. A leitmotif of the book, as you gleaned from earlier, is in some way mental health and art, insanity and art. What is the relationship between the two? And there are several sequences in the middle of the book, written in dramatic form, where I imagine a visit to Austin Riggs. Little pieces of this are true. Most of it, you'll quickly glean, is not true. It is true that a former student of mine was a former director of Austin Riggs, and I spent a little time there. In this, well, you'll hear it. I'm going to read sections from 2 of these visits, let's say, to the asylum. So the colleague says, "So good of you to interrupt your downtime rushing." She calls herself Betty the Lesser Vanderbilt. She's been here 3 months. None of the usual antipsychotics seem to touch her. Her mood mostly chipper, and she seems to enjoy her stay. She only becomes morose when we talk of discharge to a supervised residence. Gould Farm would serve her well. There's a family trust which she can access for health and welfare. We'd like to move her soon. Family, her grandmother spent time at Chestnut Lodge, and her mother seems to have suicided when the child was 6. She carries a mammy doll everywhere, says it's all she has from her mother. Lately, she's been talking about wanting to become a Jew and is obsessed with Peggy Crescent. She had worked as a librarian somewhere, maybe even locally. It's perplexing. You always taught us there's truth in delusions. Then I remembered you live up by Chesterwood, where that Crescent woman lived. You might help us unravel her delusions. What's true in this time warp? So we're introduced, and Betty, even though she's just been introduced, says, "Dr. Riggs, I do thank you." Colleague interrupting her, "No, Betty, this is Dr. Lewis, a psychiatrist from New York, a Jewish psychiatrist. You've been talking about Jews." Lewis motions her to go on. "I've got to go, but I'll be back shortly." Betty, "But Riggs, I did overhear you talking about Will and Agnes Gould again. Noble their undertaking, those Goulds, but their crazy farm is not for me. Well-intentioned people, but Aunt Emily, that is Emily Thorne Vanderbilt, and her cousin Emily Vanderbilt Sloane just won't hear of it. I know they want me back at Elm Court. I think, dear Riggs, you sometimes forget who I am, though of course we are more interested in who I will become. Isn't that right, Riggs? You remember I started the summer off with other cousins in Oyster Bay. Every night I pace, holding my head, saying, 'Oi, oi, Oyster Bay,' which they didn't like. And why is it that they ship me here off to Elm Court? I guess it's because of the 106 rooms. I had a third-floor back room, and there's enough hallway for a chronic insomniac like myself." Lewis, "Miss Vanderbilt, remember, I'm Dr. Lewis." Betty, "Come on, Austin, out with it. You thought me a bear cat at Frelinghuysen's party a few weeks back when I asked you to dance. Was it all that jizz in their jazz? Was it Jack Teagarden or Jelly Roll Morton? I'd have thought myself a sweet Sheba, no?" And their conversation goes on in this manner. And then it becomes even more delusional, let me say, when Austin Riggs himself is interviewing Betty. And she begins, she's ranting and raving, and Riggs himself says to her, "Stop it. Not that much imagination, the bee's knees. I said use your imagination, stop using other people's. You're reciting a poem by Elizabeth Bishop that wasn't written for another 28 years. And let me tell you, your recitation is wrong about the hospital," because she references St. Elizabeth's, not Austin, not his hospital. Betty says, "My good doctor, I am so sorry. Is my new self plagiarized? You're making me even more guilty. Oh, where is my mammy doll?" Sobbing, Lewis Knox goes in. On the threshold, he faces Riggs, the Austin Riggs. Riggs, "And just who might you be, young man?" Lewis shrugs as Riggs inspects his visitor's badge. It says, "Visiting psychoanalyst poet." Looks legit? Are you legit? Hard day, me too. What troubles do you bring to our house of human troubles? I'm trying to tell my patient here, dreams don't tell the future. No, I'm not a Jungian. I'm certainly not a Freudian. I'm just a humanist. And you? Lewis, me? If you want to listen, I'll bring you the world's troubles. Our own country's never been in worse shape. Almost a dictator at the helm. Race relations, poverty, worldwide refugees everywhere, kids living hungry, separated from their mothers at the border. How would you feel watching your family shot or macheted or abducted? I'm going mad. There's Russia. There's more madness. Putin. Riggs with a quizzical look. Do you mean Rasputin? We dined last week with a lesser Romanov cousin, just 5 years earlier since the revolution. I do think the Tsars will return, don't you? Lewis, stop it. Have you any idea? The world is insane and you're acting insane too. And it escalates and they have a tussle, and Betty, the lesser Vanderbilt, ties his hands behind his back. And suddenly there's a knock. And Lewis says, "The orderlies. Betty, block the door." The door opens. An elegant gentleman enters. Riggs stammering, "Check his identification." W.E.B. Du Bois. "No need, my friends." His voice pure bell. "Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois at your service." Riggs. "Doctor of what?" W.E.B. "Sociology." "Isn't that what we all need now? We must study this society. We all do live here. You know, Dr. Lewis, the individual can struggle only so much, cannot go on in double lives. Lift the veil, to quote myself. Or the trains in the station. Jim Crow won't keep you from sitting with us. Betty, a new doctor? A second opinion? W.E.B. If you wish, madame. Betty, Dr. Riggs won't help me with my guilt. Can you? He makes it worse. W.E.B. As I have told you, I am a sociologist. Your guilt is not of much concern to black folks. Betty, oh dear, she clutches her mammy abreast. I sleep better with her. W.E.B. takes the dolly, turns it over once, the dress falls, revealing a white dolly on one side, and another turn, the dress falls back, a black dolly, back and forth, black and white, black becomes white, white becomes black, all are mesmerized. W.E.B., the topsy-turvy gollywog, if only it were that simple, if only. And I'm going to read two more poems. Back to our Lincoln, which was, you can see the maquette right, if you again peek in here. This takes place the National Mall, Washington, D.C. On the mall, in front of the monument where Daniel Chester French's Lincoln sits, 1922, Memorial Day, dedication of the monument, 50,000. 1925, Ku Klux Klan, 40,000. 1939, Marian Anderson barred by the DAR from the National Cathedral, 50,000 and a nationwide radio broadcast. 1945, Nazi genocide, 400 rabbis. 1959, MLK, give us the ballot, 25,000. 1963, MLK, I have a dream, 250,000. 1969, national mobilization, end the war in Vietnam, 600,000. 1989, March for Women's Rights, 500,000. 1993, LGB Rights and Liberty, 800,000. 1995, Million Man March, 837,000. And that was probably underestimated. 2004, March for Women's Lives, 1,100,000. 2017, the Women's March Against Trump, 1,500,000. This sculpture's audience. A poem very close to the end called Imagining Adam's Meditation. And this takes off from a poem by Stanley Kunitz called The Longboat and uses a couple of his phrases. The longboat that arrives before living begins, that survives the flood. Not the boat that comes after living, that moves into the rolling fog, and the dear ones, the ones being waved to, have already lost their faces, the boat that absolves the burdens of all that caring. This is the boat that loves the waters of earth and the earth of earth, loves the gravel sounds of beaching under its hull, happy to tip to its side, astride the forest, to let its kept animals back onto earth, content to be taken apart, plank by plank, to be burned in a family hearth. Or if piece by piece drift away, they drift to drifting across the blue seas or the green, drift to other uses or to none, or if it was not a boat, it will be a train. It will be a kind of transport only approximated here. It is the coming before the going beyond. In the final poem, Last Day, Summer's End, Waiting Again at the Crossing. The blinking stops, the bells stop, if bells of the thin arm silently swings up teetering. It points to the sky. The train's last echo slows, and beyond the field, sky, he walks on, if into sky, closer to visions of pulled up, lifted through, rise up and hear the bells, the unremembered, unnamed, the far train's engine out of the west, lows, a single tequila bestowed, dark car behind, honking impatience, get on with you, speeds around, a spattering of gravel fall, progress, into the dusk dim road, the dust grows tall. Get on with you. Thank you. I think of a reading as the first part of a conversation. I don't know if our format really allows for any questions or comments. Do you think we could, if anyone has any thoughts or is wondering about something or as a response to something? Yes, I'll repeat it. Spare me.
Tell us about your writing process. Do you like to write first thing in the morning?
Oh, okay.
Do you write
Right.
late in the day?
Right. I was actually going to correct you at that because you said I had a day job and write by night. Actually, my process is the exact opposite. I'm a very early riser, and I begin every day writing before I look at emails, text messages, before my mind, gets filled up with all the exigencies and everything that has to be done. So I actually start off writing. Some days I have a longer stretch. Other days even just an hour or two, and then I begin. But I begin each day. Yes. You might need to unmask just to ask the question.
I told you I read like a novel, and I'm wondering if you actually wrote it in sequence.
Oh, thank you. Actually, that's the most wonderful thing to say to me about this book. I was really striving to write a book of mostly poetry that reads like a novel, that had the fluidity of a novel, but the intensity of the lyric. and to balance narrative and lyric forms so that one gets really the benefit. There are no, many of the poems somewhat, they do stand on their own. They're much richer in context. I mean, there are other levels of meaning. So thank you for that. Yes. That's some question. My reading of Freud, monotheism, what were the other? Moses and monotheism, civilization and its discontents, and the future of illusion. Wow, that's a dissertation right there. You know, one thing, let me just, where to answer that? Two things. One, Freud himself was very uncomfortable with his Judaism, and yet, I mean, I didn't read the poem about their visit to Clark University in Worcester, but the one non-Jew in Freud's inner circle was quickly cast out, Carl Jung. So, you know, whatever else Freud says about Moses, I think there's a lot based in conflict. Civilization and its discontents. I mean, in some ways, all of art addresses that, doesn't it? Did you have some specific thought in mind? So reflection on Freud as a Jew and art as an outsider. Well, I think it's fair to say that given how radically Freud challenged the intellectual establishment, both scientific and philosophically, really, it had to be written by an outsider. But let me just say that Freud also said, wherever I go, poets have been before. It's one of my favorite quotes of Freud. So the question was the relationship between my practice and writing. I am not someone who writes about my patients. I don't use my patients in my writing. That doesn't mean that a turn of phrase might not trigger something. But to me, it's all about language and about meaningful communication and finding ways to powerfully and emotionally and immediately communicate. And in that sense, that's what I do as a psychiatrist, and that's what I do as a poet. It's all language. How long have I been writing poetry? What got me interested? Well, what's that little children's Scholastic magazine? Yeah, so I remember 6 or 7 when I'm first reading, looking at these little poems, and I said, that's kind of magical. You know, that you can actually make words rhyme. I didn't know anything about rhyme. And I said, I want to do that. So, you know, I mean, part of me was writing really early. And I wrote regularly, fiction also, up until about 30 or so, a little into my 30s. Then I had children. One is here, my granddaughter's here. And between building a practice and being a father, there was no headspace. So it sort of drifted away. And then maybe 12 or more years ago, I I started writing again, and then I realized this was sort of coming back to an old inspiration, and just been working very hard at it ever since. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Chesterwood. Thank you, Donna. And take a peek in the studio, if you will.